Hi, it's Markos. I'm a current third-year medical student at the University of Cambridge. In this video, I'm going to tell you exactly how to write a great essay for the Section 3 component of the BMAT, giving you tips that I used to help me achieve a 4A when I applied to medical school. Firstly, let's talk a bit about why the BMAT essay is important. Most universities won't use the BMAT essay as an input for the holistic impression of you as a student for when they're determining whether to accept you or not. Instead, they'll use it as a cutoff. Thus, having a great BMAT score doesn't really benefit you that much. However, having a really bad one can really hurt your chances for getting into your university of choice. Generally, getting a 2.5 B or A is the minimum that is required to get into med school. I know someone who got in with a 2.5 in their BMAT essay, and they even got a first in both first and second year. So they're really doing consistently great in both the MCQ and essay components of the course. So it's okay to score the minimum that med school's required, and there isn't really that much benefit to getting a 4 or a 5. However, it is important to secure your score so that this isn't a limiting factor in your application. Now let's get started with how to write a really great essay. So the BMAT specification for a level 4, which I believe is a good benchmark to aim for, obviously you might only get a 3 or a 3.5, but a 4 is a good aim, says that you need to write a good answer with few weaknesses, where all the aspects of the question are addressed, and that the argument is rational and coherent, and there is a balanced consideration of both the proposition and the counter-proposition. From this statement, I've broken it down into 3 separate things you need to do, and let me go through them now. Firstly, you need to write with good grammar and good spelling. This will contribute mainly to your letter grade, A to E. However, sentence structure and clear writing is important to the communication aspect of the number grade, and therefore it's really important that you get this simple part right. Therefore, I'd suggest in the exam, and even when practicing, take your time to write out sentences that really make sense. Don't rush into things, as this can lead to confusing ideas. You have plenty of time to write, as it's not a huge amount. So make sure you write each sentence deliberately and with perfect grammar. If you are unsure about a sentence before writing it, pause, take a step back, think about how you might be able to change it to make it more coherent, and then write it. It's really worth taking the time to do this, because you don't want the reason that you didn't get into medical school to be bad grammar. The second part is to have all of the necessary components of the BMAT essay. These being an introduction, an argument, a counter-argument, and a conclusion. Let me run through each of these and exactly how you would write this in the BMAT essay. So firstly, you would write a short introduction. This would start with one simple sentence that would define the keywords. These definitions allow you to set the stage for what you're going to talk about and limit the scope of the essay. You don't want to define things too broadly and then have too much to talk about. Additionally, in the introduction, you're going to have a second sentence. The question basically always asks, explain what you think is meant by this statement, or something along those lines. Do not simply repeat the question. Instead, give your interpretation of the question. Describe what you think this statement is actually about. The specification clearly says that you need to address all, in block capitals, the parts of the question, and this is the most common part that is missed out. So make sure you really give your interpretation of the statement. A very good way of ensuring that you do this, and that the examiner knows you're doing this, is to signpost it with concise language. This statement suggests that, and so on. So to reiterate, the introduction only needs 2 sentences. 1, to define the keywords, and 2, to state what you think is meant by the statement. So moving on to paragraph 1, this is where you make your main argument. This is generally where you would argue for a statement when prompted. So to start off with, you would have one short sentence that clearly defines your argument. This argument can then be supported by evidence. If there is space, provide 2 pieces of evidence, particularly if you're typing, because you have 550 words to write, instead of the more or less 300 that you would get when handwriting. Again, using signposting language is useful. This argument is supported by the theory of so on and so on. Make sure to always follow up your claims with evidence, as this is the key to writing a decent BMAT essay. If you are unsure about where to source these pieces of evidence and how to actually integrate these within your essay, in my next video on BMAT Section 3, I will cover how to prepare for the essay, including how to develop your repertoire of evidence, so make sure you subscribe to keep an eye out for that. Finally, still in this paragraph, consider concluding on it with a short sentence at the end. However, this isn't always necessary, especially with the lack of space of a handwritten BMAT essay. If you do choose to write a small conclusion, then make sure this isn't just a repetition of whatever it is you're saying in the actual paragraph. Instead, it should have a small bit of original thought in this sentence. This concluding sentence is quite hard to get right, so I wouldn't recommend it for most people. So moving on to paragraph 2, make your counter argument. Going back to the BMAT specifications, it says you need a balanced consideration of the proposition and the counter proposition. This is your counter proposition, and therefore it needs to be balanced. You can't have a huge paragraph for your argument and then basically nothing going against it. Therefore, try to keep paragraphs 1 and 2 pretty much the same size, as this will ensure you have given the same amount of thought to each argument. Paragraph 2 is basically the same as paragraph 1. However, you start off with a few words of a linker, so in contrast to this, and so on, and then you give your small phrase that defines your counter-argument. Again, this counter-argument must be supported by evidence. Do this in the same way as you did it in the first paragraph. Finally, we have the conclusion. The conclusion serves to bring together all of the points you've made and for you to state your opinion on the matter. With this, do not sit on the fence. You need to actually make a conclusion. Don't be afraid to be steadfast in this. However, don't just pick one side of the argument and be like, this is clearly the best and the other argument doesn't matter and we should totally ignore it, because the question will lend itself to actually quite balanced conclusions. And also, this shows a complete lack of maturity in argumentation. You need to show that you can consider two sides of a debate. Instead, you need to make an informed conclusion that takes a defined position. So you need to take a position, but considers the limitations of such a position. Doing this well will bring your essay to very high standards. Let me give an example. You may conclude that chocolate is the best flavor of ice cream overall. However, mango is better in certain situations, such as at the beach. You are taking a position, yet considering the limitations. Do this every time and you'll have great essays on your hands. So bringing me back to my main point, you need to have all of the components of the essay. If you don't have these, then you're not going to get a good score. You need to have them to hit the threshold to get into medical school. So the way you can guarantee that you do have all of these components is firstly, knowing which components you need to include, and secondly, by planning your essay. Even if in the exam you only write down introduction and then the short sentence for your argument, a short sentence for your counter argument, and then you literally just write conclusion, that's enough to make sure that you do hit all of the checkpoints, because ultimately that's what's most important in a BMAT essay. So finally, the third thing you have to do is to write concisely and clearly. Now, obviously, this skill comes over the years with practice in writing in English. And for example, if English isn't your second language, you're going to have a lot more trouble doing this. However, there are certain things you can do to bypass this, even with not such a great mastery over the English language. Often, writing very short sentences with punchy points are very effective in highlighting your exact argument. Make sure to contrast the first paragraph to the second paragraph. Use linker words such as in contrast to this or on the other hand. Make sure to use signposting language when you're using evidence. This argument is supported by the theory of ideas like these will really bring up the communication aspects of your BMAT essays. So when you are practicing, make sure to really hone in on these things if you do struggle with writing clearly and concisely. Now I'm going to cover a few extra things that you can do to make your essay stand out and hit the 4s and the 5s. Having great examples as evidence that support your arguments is obviously something you can do to hit those high scores. However, it's okay to use more generic examples that you might see in an everyday healthcare setting, because as long as it supports your point, then it's a valid piece of evidence that you can use. However, if you go above and beyond what is expected from you, and you pull ideas from articles and books you have read and theories that you may have learned in school that other people may not be talking about, this will propel your essay into the 4s and 5s, and alongside concise writing and great structuring, then you should be able to secure quite a high mark, more than enough to pass the minimums set by med schools. I hope this short rundown on how to write a BMAT essay has helped. If so, then give this video a like and maybe subscribe if you want to see future videos. If you want to watch any of my other videos on admissions, then click here or here. I'm sure YouTube has recommended something relevant to you. I'll see you in the next one.